The silence was the first thing I noticed after Arthur died. It wasn't the heavy, aching silence of grief I had expected after 62 years of marriage. No, this was something else entirely. It was a clean, open silence, like a window being pushed open in a stuffy, sealed room for the first time in a generation. For 3 days, I just sat in his favorite armchair, the worn leather still holding the faint indent of his body, and I let that strange, liberating quiet wash over me. It felt like coming up for air after a lifetime spent held just beneath the surface of the water. Comment on which city you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Because I guarantee there's more to this story than meets the eye. The quiet is just the beginning, my son. David was the first to break it. He arrived on the fourth day. Not with a casserole or a hug, but with a sleek leather briefcase and a face full of practiced, solemn concern. "Mom," he said, his voice the same low, reasonable tone Arthur always used when he was about to explain my own feelings to me or tell me what was best for us. "We need to start making some practical decisions, the house, the finances. Dad handled everything, and we can't let things fall apart." My daughter, Sarah, was right behind him, a shadow of anxiety, wringing her hands and dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a pristine tissue. "We're just so worried about you being all alone in this big place," she added, her voice a soft, feathered weapon of guilt. They sat on the couch opposite me, a united front of sensible, capable children taking charge of their confused, grieving mother. But I wasn't confused for the first time in what felt like my entire life. I was terrifyingly, breathtakingly clear. I watched the way David held his briefcase on his lap, just as his father always had, using it as a shield of authority. I saw the way Sarah's eyes darted around the living room, not lingering on family photographs, but assessing the dimensions, her mind calculating square footage and resale value. And in that moment, a cold, hard thought took root in my mind. A thought so disloyal, so monstrous after 6 decades of marriage, that it made my breath catch in my throat. They weren't here to help me, they were here to manage me. The manager was dead, and they were applying for his position. It started with small things, the gentle erosion of self, the way it always had with Arthur. "Mom, you don't need to be cooking, it's too much for you right now. We'll set up a meal delivery service," David announced, waving away my instinctive offer of coffee as if I were a child playing with a toy stove. "Dad wouldn't want you tiring yourself out." Sarah, ever the diligent assistant, began going through the kitchen cabinets, making a list on her phone. "A lot of this is expired. Mother, we should just do a big clear out. Start fresh." They spoke about me as if I weren't in the room, their words swirling around my head, wrapping me in a familiar, suffocating blanket of meticulous care. Every suggestion, every offer of help, felt less like a kindness and more like the gentle, inexorable tightening of a leash. I spent my days nodding and smiling, playing the part they expected. The sweet old widow, lost in her grief, grateful for their guidance. But at night, when the house was mine again, the silence became my co-conspirator. It gave me space to think, to remember things I hadn't allowed myself to consider for decades. I decided to start with his closet, the place that smelled most intensely of him, a scent of cedar blocks, old paper, and the faint, crisp chemical tang from the dry cleaner. I began packing his suits into boxes, lining up his polished shoes, methodically rolling the collection of silk ties I'd given him every Christmas. It was a methodical, mindless task, a way to keep my hands busy while my mind raced. Until my fingers brushed against a small, metal box tucked away on the highest shelf, hidden behind a stack of brittle, yellowed hats he never wore. It was an old biscuit tin, the painted flowers on its lid faded and dented. I'd seen it 100 times over the years, a familiar fixture in the archaeology of our shared life. "Just nuts and bolts, Eleanor," he'd say with a dismissive wave if I ever asked about it. "Nothing for you to worry your pretty head about." His voice was so clear in my memory, so perfectly rendered, it was like he was standing right behind me, his hand about to rest on my shoulder. "Don't worry your pretty head about it," the 4 most common words of our marriage. I realized the gentle pat that ended every conversation. I pulled the box down, a small cloud of dust puffing into the air and catching in the dim light. It was heavier than nuts and bolts would be, and it was locked. A tiny, rusty little padlock, no bigger than my thumb, held it shut. A shiver of something, not fear, but a strange, thrilling, terrifying curiosity, ran down my spine. Why would you lock up a box of old hardware? It made no sense. I carried the box into the kitchen and found the bolt cutters Arthur kept in the junk drawer for cutting garden wire. The snap of the metal breaking was shockingly loud in the quiet house. A sound of violation and finality, my heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. I lifted the lid. There were no nuts and bolts inside. There were letters, dozens and dozens of them, tied in neat bundles with brittle, old twine, and beneath them all, a small, black leather-bound diary. The handwriting on the first bundle I picked up was immediately, achingly familiar, though I hadn't seen it in nearly 40 years. It was my sister, Mary's looping, optimistic cursive, the kind of beautiful script they don't teach in schools anymore. The postmarks were from the spring and summer of 1975. I untied the twine, my hands trembling so badly I could barely work the knot. The first letter began, "Dearest Eleanor, I'm so worried. You sounded so small on the phone yesterday. So distant. Is Arthur treating you well? You know you can tell me if he's not. You can always come home. Always." I unfolded another and another. "Eleanor, why haven't you written back? I've called 3 times and Arthur always says you're resting. We're out. I know you said he handles the mail, but surely you can post a letter yourself? I'm sending this one to Mrs. Gable next door, hoping she'll pass it to you secretly. Please, Ellie, just call me." I sank heavily into a kitchen chair. The letters fanned out on the table like a hand of damning cards. He had hidden them. My own sister's words, her offers of help, her desperate, reaching love, he had intercepted them, judged them, and stolen them from me. He had told me she was busy with her own growing family, that her life in another state had made her distant. He'd said, with that patient, knowing smile, "People drift apart, Eleanor. It's the natural way of things. We have our own family to focus on now. We are all that matters." He hadn't just let us drift. He had taken an axe and cut the rope, leaving me isolated on his own private island. For the next few hours, I pieced together the ghost of a life I could have had, a life I never knew was an option. There were letters from my old college friend, Clara, the wild, funny artist who'd been my maid of honor. She'd invited me to visit her in California, offered me a job at the new art gallery she was opening. "You were always the talented one. Ellie," she wrote in a letter full of exclamation points. "Don't you dare let that incredible light go out." Arthur had told me Clara had become a flighty, unreliable person, chasing foolish dreams. He'd said her bohemian lifestyle was not something we should expose our children to. I found letters from my own mother, written in the last year of her life, her handwriting shaky but her words clear, begging me to come see her alone. "Arthur is a fine man," she wrote, "but he hovers. He answers for you. I just want to see my daughter, just for a day." He had told me my mother was confused and paranoid in her final days, that it was best to remember her as she was, vibrant and strong. Every lie he had ever told me was laid bare on my kitchen table. He hadn't been protecting me. He had been hoarding me. The love I thought was a warm, safe blanket was actually a cage, meticulously woven, thread by invisible thread, so carefully and so slowly that I had never even noticed the bars. I had spent my life believing his constant attention was devotion, his management of our lives a sign of his competence and care. Now, as an old woman with the evidence spread before me, I saw the truth. The beautiful house he'd insisted we buy, far from my family, was not a home. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out and to keep me in. The financial security he provided was not a gift. It was a tool to ensure my complete and utter dependence. His constant, hovering presence was not devotion. It was surveillance. The front door opened, the sound making me jump. David's voice called out, "Mom, we brought dinner. Didn't you hear us knocking?" He and Sarah walked into the kitchen and stopped short, their cheerful expressions dissolving. They saw me at the table, a strange creature surrounded by piles of faded paper, my face pale in the evening light. Sarah gasped, rushing to my side. "Mother, what's all this? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," I said, my voice raspy, unfamiliar to my own ears. "I've seen a whole chorus of them." I held up one of Mary's letters, the paper as fragile as a dead leaf. David's eyes narrowed, his face hardening into the same mask of calm, paternal authority his father used to wear so effectively. "Mom, you shouldn't be upsetting yourself with all this old stuff. It's ancient history. Let's get it cleared away and have some dinner." He reached for the letters, his movements smooth and practiced, the way one would take a dangerous object from a child. But I snatched them back, my hands surprisingly quick. For the first time in my life, I looked at my son and saw a stranger, a man shaped and molded by the architect of my prison. No, I said, the word feeling foreign and powerful on my tongue. This is not ancient history. This is my life, the one I wasn't allowed to live. Sarah looked utterly lost, her gaze flickering between my face and David's. What do you mean, Mom? Dad gave you a wonderful life. Her words were the echo of a story I had told myself for 62 years. It was the family myth, the sacred text, the foundation upon which everything was built. And I had just taken a sledgehammer to it. David sighed, that long-suffering, infinitely patient sound he had perfected. She's overwrought, he said to Sarah, not to me. Grief does strange things to people. We'll come back tomorrow when she's feeling calmer. He tried to steer me toward the living room, his hand on my elbow, a gesture of gentle, implacable control. I pulled my arm away as if his touch had burned me. I am perfectly calm, I said, my voice low and steady, each word a carefully placed stone. And tomorrow we are going to talk about this. All of us. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty in his eyes. The balance of power in the room had shifted, and he could feel it too. The silence that followed them out the door was no longer peaceful. It was the taut, humming silence of a battle about to begin. The next morning, they returned, armed with their usual weapons of sympathy and condescension. Sarah brought a basket of freshly baked muffins. David brought his briefcase, from which he produced a glossy folder of financial documents. They were ready to resume their roles as the capable children handling their fragile, confused mother. They set everything on the coffee table and sat across from me, their faces arranged in careful masks of love and concern. But I had spent the night awake, not rereading the letters of a life lost, but reading Arthur's small, black diary. And what I found in there had frozen the last dregs of my grief into a hard, cold, diamond-sharp knot of fury. Mom, David began, tapping the folder with a manicured finger. I've spoken with our financial advisor. Given your situation, the best course of action is to put the house on the market and move you into the Rosewood Senior Community. It's very nice, great facilities. Dad and I actually toured it a few years ago. He trailed off, the words hanging in the air as he realized what he'd just admitted. You and Dad? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. You were planning my life after his death. Before he was even gone? Sarah jumped in, her hands fluttering like startled birds. It wasn't like that. Dad was just planning for the future. He was always thinking ahead. He wanted to make sure you were always taken care of. He loved you so much. He did not love me, I said, and the words landed in the room with the force of thrown stones, sharp and brutal. He loved the idea of me. He loved owning me. And he taught you both to do the same. David scoffed, a humorless, angry sound that was pure Arthur. That's a ridiculous, hurtful thing to say. Dad dedicated his entire life to you. Did he? I leaned forward, my old bones aching with a new and unfamiliar kind of strength. Or did he dedicate his life to controlling me? Let's talk about my sister, Mary. He told me she was too busy to visit, that she didn't approve of our life. But here, I slid one of her desperate, pleading letters across the polished wood of the table. She is begging me to call her, begging me to leave him. Sarah picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the page, her face growing pale. I don't understand. Oh, I think you do, I said, my gaze fixed on David, the son who had learned his lessons so well. Let's talk about the money. My inheritance from my parents. Arthur told me it was all lost in a bad investment back in the 80s. He said he was too ashamed to ever tell me the details. But his diary tells a very different story. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the suffocating silence. I could see the dawning of true panic in David's eyes. He knew what was coming. Subscribe now, you won't believe the twist that's coming. This goes deeper than you can imagine. I opened the black diary. Arthur's handwriting was small and precise. Every letter a perfectly formed soldier standing in a neat line. The entries weren't daily musings or emotional reflections. They were strategic plans, operational notes. He wrote about our marriage as if it were a business he was managing, a delicate project requiring constant oversight. He detailed his methods for guiding my choices, for protecting me from what he called unhelpful outside influences, my friends, my family, my own ambitions. He called it his duty of care, but the entries from the last few years were the most damning. I have placed Eleanor's inheritance, along with a significant portion of our joint assets, into a separate irrevocable trust. I read aloud, my voice clear and unwavering, a courtroom prosecutor delivering a final verdict. I have designated David and Sarah as the trustees, but the funds will only be released to them in full upon her passing. There is a condition. They must adhere to the family principles I have established and follow my explicit, written instructions for her continued well-being and care. This will ensure she is never left to her own devices, which would be a great disservice to her gentle, suggestible nature. It will guarantee they care for her as I have. The room was utterly still, the only sound Sarah's choked sob. Silent tears were streaming down her face. David just stared at me, his jaw tight, his carefully constructed composure finally shattering like cheap glass. It wasn't just that they were following their father's example out of habit. It was a condition of their inheritance. He was controlling me from beyond the grave, using our own children as his puppets, his enforcers. Their concern, their worry, their sensible plans, it was all a performance. A carefully rehearsed play written by a dead man, with a multi-million-dollar payout waiting at the final curtain. He didn't trust you, I said to David, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. He didn't even trust his own son to control me properly. He had to bribe you to do it. David finally broke. He slammed his hand down on the coffee table, making the muffins jump and the folder slide to the floor. He did it to protect you. And to protect the family. You don't understand how the world works, Mom. You never have. You're naive. You're too soft. You would have given all that money away or been swindled out of it in a week. He knew that. He did what he had to do to keep you safe. His words were a perfect, chilling echo of his father's. The same logic, the same condescending tone, the same absolute certainty. For 62 years, I had believed that I was the lucky one, the cherished, protected wife of a strong, capable man. Now I saw the truth. I was a project, a possession, a valuable asset to be managed. And my children were my wardens. I remembered a time, so long ago, early in our marriage. I had wanted to take a pottery class. I loved the feel of the cool, wet clay, the way you could shape something beautiful and useful out of a simple lump of earth. Arthur had been supportive at first, indulgent even. Then he started showing up at the studio near the end of class, just to see my progress. He'd stand in the doorway with his arms crossed, his presence a silent judgment that sucked all the joy and creativity out of the room. He'd critique my work with a gentle, loving smile. It's a bit lopsided, isn't it, dear? Perhaps your time would be better spent on the garden. That's something we can both enjoy. I quit the class a week later. I told myself it was because I wasn't very good at it. But the truth was, he couldn't stand the thought of me having something that was just mine. Something he couldn't oversee, improve, and control. Another memory surfaced, sharp as a shard of glass. My friend Clara, before he had methodically and patiently pushed her out of my life, had told me once, over coffee, "Eleanor, don't let him shrink your world down to the size of his house." I hadn't understood what she meant then. I thought my world was full, a loving husband, 2 beautiful children, a comfortable home. I didn't realize he was slowly, methodically, breaking up all the windows and doors, until the only view I had, the only light I saw, was the one he permitted. Was any of it real? I whispered, the question aimed at my children, at the ghosts in the room, at my own foolish heart. The family dinners? The holidays? Or was it all just following the rules? Sarah sobbed, finally breaking her silence. I loved you, Mom. I do love you. But it was just how things were. Dad had a way, a system for everything. It was just easier to go along with it. He always said it was for the best. I didn't know about the trust, not the details, I swear. Just that we had to look after you. Her confession was weak, pathetic, a flimsy excuse, but it was a tiny crack in the wall of their united front. David, however, was his father's son to the core. It was for the best, he insisted, his voice hard, his conviction absolute. Look at the life you had. You never wanted for anything. I wanted for everything. I shot back, my voice rising for the first time, thin and reedy but full of a lifetime of suppressed rage. I wanted a voice. I wanted a choice. I wanted my sister. I wanted my friends. I wanted to know who the hell I was without him standing over my shoulder telling me. You say I never wanted for anything? I never had anything that was truly mine. Not even my own thoughts. The confrontation drained the last of my energy. I suddenly felt 100 years old. I looked at the two people I had brought into this world, the two people I thought I knew better than myself, and I saw the toxic legacy of my husband's quiet, smiling tyranny. He had not only controlled me, he had poisoned them too. He had taught them that love was not about freedom and respect, but about possession and management. David was a willing participant, a man who had clearly inherited the crown and found it fit perfectly. Sarah was a more tragic figure, a woman so used to the comfort of the cage that she had helped lock the door on her own mother without a second thought. I want you to leave, I said, my voice flat and empty of all emotion. Both of you. Sarah started to protest, her programming kicking in. Mom, we can't just leave you here alone. You have been leaving me alone my entire life, I interrupted, the truth of the words startling me. You just didn't realize it. Get out of my house. David stood up, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. He picked up his briefcase, his shield. Fine, he said, his voice clipped and final. But you're making a huge mistake. You're emotional. You're not thinking clearly. When you realize you can't handle things on your own, you can call me. But we will be proceeding as Dad instructed. It wasn't a plea, it was a threat. The system was still in place. He was still in charge. They left. The front door clicked shut, and the silence rushed back in. But this time, it was different again. It wasn't peaceful, and it wasn't tense. It was the vast, terrifying, exhilarating silence of absolute, untethered freedom. I was 82 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, no one was telling me what to do, what to think, or who to be. I was completely and utterly alone, and I had never felt more powerful. For a week, I didn't answer their constant, frantic calls. I let the meal delivery service knock until they gave up leaving bags on the porch. I ate toast and jam for dinner, sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the letters that had rewritten my past. I read Arthur's diary from cover to cover, not with pain anymore, but with the cold detachment of a researcher studying an alien species. It was a chilling document, a masterclass manual for psychological warfare disguised as a love story. He wrote about our first date, noting my charming but worrying tendency toward fanciful ideas that would need to be grounded in reality. He wrote about our wedding day, expressing his profound satisfaction that I was now safely under his care. He documented, with chilling pride, every time he'd subtly undermined my confidence, every friend he'd engineered out of my life, every single decision he'd made on my behalf for my own good. He truly believed he was doing the right thing. In his twisted, patriarchal worldview, women, and especially me, his Eleanor, were delicate, emotional creatures who needed the firm, logical hand of a man to guide them through the complexities of life. He wasn't a monster in his own eyes. He was a hero, a protector, a loving guardian. And that, I realized, was the most insidious part of it all. The control had been so absolute because it was wrapped in the language of love and protection. He had convinced me, the children, and the entire world that his prison was a paradise built just for me. On the 8th day, I made a phone call. Not to my children, but to a lawyer. I found a woman online, a Ms. Anya Sharma, whose website said she specialized in elder law and complex estate litigation. I sat in her bright, modern office, a world away from the dark wood and heavy, light-blocking curtains of my own home. I told her everything. I showed her the letters. I showed her the diary. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable, asking sharp, insightful questions. When I was finished, my throat raw from talking more than I had in years, she looked at me with a mixture of profound sympathy and cold steel. Mr. Crawford was a very thorough man, she said, tapping a pen on the copy of the trust document David had foolishly left behind on the coffee table. This is a tightly constructed document. The clause about adhering to his family principles is deliberately vague. But the instruction to follow his explicit plans for your care is specific. Challenging it will be difficult. I don't want their money, I said simply. I don't care about the inheritance. I just want to be free of him. Free of them. Ms. Sharma leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. Eleanor, the trust isn't just about their inheritance. It controls your assets, too. The house, the stocks, your personal savings, it was all in joint names. He structured this so that while you are the primary beneficiary for your lifetime, they are the trustees with full administrative power. Right now, as we speak, they can sell this house right out from under you, as long as they put you in an appropriate care facility that meets their father's standards. According to this document, they have all the power. The blood drained from my face. Of course, he had done that. He had left me with nothing that was truly my own, not even in death. The cage was more perfect, more complete than I had ever imagined. For a long, silent moment, I felt the old despair wash over me, the familiar, paralyzing feeling of helplessness. This was it. I had discovered the truth too late. I was an old woman with no resources, no allies, and no power. The system would win. It always did. But then I looked at the pile of letters I'd brought with me, sitting on Ms. Sharma's gleaming desk. I saw my sister's beautiful, looping handwriting, my friend Clara's joyful exclamation points. I saw the ghosts of the woman I could have been, the artist, the sister, the traveler, the friend. And a spark of defiance, a tiny pilot light I thought had been extinguished 50 years ago, ignited in my chest. He had stolen my past. His children were trying to steal my future. But right now, in this moment, the present was mine. So we fight, I said, my voice shaking but firm. We find a way. There is always a way. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Ms. Sharma's face. Yes, Eleanor, she said. We do. The first step was a simple one, yet it felt monumental. I went home and packed a suitcase. I walked through the house, my house, one last time. Every object held two memories now. The happy, gilded one I had lived with for 60 years, and the dark, true one I now understood. The wedding photo on the mantel, was I smiling with joy or with the naive relief of a girl who thought she'd finally found safety? The little clay bird one of the kids had made for me in grade school, which Arthur had relegated to a back shelf because it was clutter. Was it a child's simple gift or a painful reminder of a passion I'd been forced to abandon? I didn't have the answers, and maybe I never would. I took one thing from the wall. A small framed watercolor of a rocky coastline I had painted on our honeymoon. It was the only piece of my own art that Arthur had ever allowed to be displayed. And he'd only done so because it was a memory of a time that was all about him. I carefully took it out of the frame, rolled it up, and put it in my handbag. Then I called a taxi. As I sat in the back of the car, pulling away from the curb, I saw David's car pull up to the house. He got out, a look of grim determination on his face, briefcase in hand, ready for another round of battle to bring me to heel. He stopped and watched my taxi pull away, his expression shifting from anger to utter confusion. For the first time, I had done something he couldn't predict, something not covered in his father's instruction manual. I didn't go to a hotel. I went to the airport. I used the emergency credit card I had secretly kept hidden in a book for years, a tiny act of rebellion I hadn't even understood myself at the time, to buy a one-way ticket to San Diego. I sent one single text message before I turned off my phone, my heart pounding with fear and exhilaration. It was to Clara. I had no idea if her number was the same after 40 years. I simply wrote, "The light isn't out yet. Putting the kettle on?" When the plane took off, I looked out at the city, at the neat, orderly rows of houses shrinking below me. For 62 years, I had lived in one of those houses, in a world that was small and safe and utterly suffocating. A world built for me by a man who loved me so much he couldn't bear for me to be free. Now, the world was vast and unknown. I was 82 years old, flying into a future I had no map for, with nothing but a small painting and a lifetime of stolen letters in my bag. I had no idea what would happen next. But as the plane climbed above the clouds and the sun flooded the cabin with brilliant, blinding light, I felt the corners of my mouth turn up into a real, genuine smile. The silence in my head was finally, truly my own. And it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The moment I stepped off the plane, the warm, salt-tinged air of California felt like it belonged to a different planet. I stood there for a moment amidst the chaos of people rushing to greet loved ones, feeling utterly lost and ridiculously, wildly brave. My phone had been off for the entire flight. My hands trembled as I turned it back on. It buzzed to life with a dozen missed calls from David and Sarah, and a string of increasingly frantic, then angry, then pleading text messages. I ignored them all. There was only one message I was looking for. And there it was. A reply from a number I didn't recognize, sent hours ago. It simply said, "Kettle's been on for 40 years, Ellie. I'm at the arrivals curb. Look for the crazy old lady with purple hair." I laughed, a real, bubbling up from the soul laugh that turned a few heads. And there she was. Clara. Her hair was indeed a vibrant shade of lavender, cut in a sassy, short style that defied her age. She was leaning against a beat-up red convertible, wearing huge sunglasses and an even bigger grin. We stared at each other for a long moment, two old women with a lifetime of silence stretching between us. Then we both rushed forward and hugged, clinging to each other like we were drowning and the other was a life raft. "You came," she whispered into my hair, her voice thick with emotion. "I always knew you would, someday." Clara's house was a small, colorful bungalow overflowing with books, paintings, and half-finished sculptures. It was messy and vibrant and gloriously, chaotically alive. It was everything my own house was not. Over the next few days, fueled by endless cups of tea, I told her everything. I read her the letters she had written to me all those years ago, and we cried together for the friendship that had been stolen from us. She wasn't angry at me for not replying. She was incandescent with fury at Arthur. "That charming, smiling monster," she called him, hitting the nail on the head. "I saw it, you know. Even back then. I tried to warn you. He had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world, as long as you stayed inside the perfect little box he built for you." With Clara's boisterous, unwavering support, I felt my strength returning. Ms. Sharma was working tirelessly back home, filing motions and creating legal roadblocks to stop David from selling the house. It was a long, slow, expensive process, but for the first time, it was my fight on my terms. David's texts turned from demanding to pleading. Sarah's were just filled with guilt and confusion. "Mom, please just come home. We can talk about this. We miss you." I knew what they missed. They missed the quiet, compliant woman I used to be. They missed the predictable order of their world. I was chaos now, a variable their father had not accounted for, and they didn't know what to do with me. One afternoon, Clara and I drove to the coast. I stood on the cliffs overlooking the vast Pacific Ocean, the rolled-up watercolor I'd painted on my honeymoon in my hand. I looked at the crashing waves, at the endless expanse of blue. That painting was the last piece of him I was holding on to. It was a symbol of a beginning I now knew was a lie. With a deep breath that tasted of salt and freedom, I held it out and let the wind snatch it from my fingers. It soared for a moment, a flash of faded color against the bright sky, before tumbling down into the churning water below, disappearing forever. I wasn't erasing the past. I was finally letting it go. A few months later, Ms. Sharma called with a breakthrough. In his obsessive need for control, his meticulous planning, Arthur had finally made a mistake. He had created the trust, but he had funded it with assets that were legally half mine under marital property laws. More importantly, he had moved my personal inheritance into it without my written consent, forging my signature on one of the key transfer documents from 1985. It was a long shot, she said, a gamble on a decades-old crime, but it was enough to prove fraudulent conveyance. It was enough to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. At my insistence, I agreed to meet my children in Ms. Sharma's neutral conference room. I flew back, not to the old house, but to a small, anonymous hotel. When I walked into that room, they both stood up. They looked older, worn down. The fight had taken its toll on them, too. David spoke first, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance, replaced by a weary resignation. "Mom, we've seen the documents. The signature. I didn't know Dad did that. We're willing to dissolve the trust. Everything will be turned over to you. the house, the money, all of it. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was a complete and total surrender. I looked at them, my son and my daughter, and the white-hot anger I had felt for so long had finally faded, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. It was never about the money, I said quietly. It was about the lies. Did you ever once, in all these years, think to ask me what I wanted? Sarah started to cry, real, messy tears this time. We thought we were doing what was best. We thought we were loving you the way he taught us to. And that was the heart of it. They were victims, too, in their own way. Cogs in a machine they never had the courage or the imagination to question. I would never have the easy, simple relationship with my children that I once thought I did. The trust was broken in more ways than one, and some things can never be fully repaired. But they were still my children. The trust will be dissolved, I said, looking at Ms. Sharma, who nodded. I am going to sell the house. And I am going to split the entire estate into 3 equal parts. One for me, one for you, David, and one for you, Sarah. David looked shocked. Mom, you don't have to do that. I know, I said. It's not a reward. It's not forgiveness. It's a choice. My choice. What you do with your share is up to you. But you will have no say in what I do with mine. My new life began at 82. I didn't move back to California to live with Clara, though I visit often. I bought a small apartment in a city I'd always wanted to explore, one with museums and theaters and sprawling green parks. I took a pottery class. My hands are old and stiff with arthritis, and my pots are hopelessly lopsided. But they are mine. I reconnected with my sister, Mary. We talk on the phone every week, slowly, carefully rebuilding the bridge that Arthur burned down all those years ago. I am building a new life, a small life, a quiet life. But it is a life of my own making, from the ground up. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I think of Arthur. I don't feel anger anymore, or even hate. I just feel a profound sense of pity for a man who was so terrified of losing control that he never learned how to truly love. He built a fortress and called it a marriage, and in the end, he was just as much a prisoner in it as I was. My freedom is my final answer to him. Every day that I wake up and decide for myself what I will do, who I will see, and what I will think, that is my victory. I spent most of my life as a postscript in someone else's story. Now, at long last, I am finally writing my own. Comment which part of the story left you speechless. Your stories matter.